Hey, friends. We're working our butts off to bring you this content, just for your entertainment. If you like what you see, here's a deal: instead of offering us tea, just hit that subscribe button. It's way easier, totally free, and honestly makes us just as happy. Let's start the story for you. My life started the way a lot of lives do when you don't yet know to question the script you've been handed. I was a kid who learned early that approval could be earned by being simple. Don't be too loud. Don't be too sensitive. Don't be too strange. In my family, nobody said those rules out loud, but they were in the air the same way weather is in the air. You learned it by watching what got praised and what got ignored. You learned it when you cried and someone tried to fix it by telling you to stop, instead of asking why. You learned it when you liked something and then saw the look on an adult's face that told you you'd liked the wrong thing. I wasn't miserable. That's important. I had friends, I laughed, I played sports badly but with enough commitment to keep getting invited back. I did the normal things that made adults nod approvingly. If you'd asked me at 16 who I was, I would have said things that sounded like a resume: hardworking, loyal, easygoing, a good kid. I would have meant it. I would also have been leaving things out, not because I was hiding some secret plan, but because I didn't yet know that some parts of you only become visible when you stop running your life like a checklist. There were small moments, though quiet, almost invisible moments, that I didn't have language for. Like the way certain clothes looked soft, not just on the outside but in the way they seemed to allow someone's body to relax. Or the way girls in my class seemed permitted to be expressive in ways the boys were punished for, to be tender, to be artistic, to be uncertain without being called weak. Sometimes I'd notice the difference and feel a tug of envy that didn't fit any category I knew. It wasn't about wanting to be someone else exactly. It was about wanting to be allowed. Wanting permission to take up emotional space without it being a performance of toughness. I kept that tug filed away under random thoughts, the way you file away anything that might complicate your place in the world. I built a life that made sense to other people. I went to school, found work, got better at being competent. Competence became my hiding place. If I did everything right, showed up, paid bills, took care of responsibilities, then no one would ask deeper questions. Not even me. Then I met my partner, and for the first time the version of me I'd been presenting to the world started to feel less like a safe mask and more like a cramped room. It wasn't because my partner demanded anything. If anything, they were the first person I'd ever been with who seemed genuinely curious about what I felt, not just what I did. We didn't fall in love in a cinematic way. It was slower than that. We became friends first. We learned each other's rhythms, the small tells that signaled stress, joy, or the need for quiet. We argued, but we repaired. We shared chores, shared worries, shared long talks that drifted into the kind of silence that isn't empty but comfortable. If you'd asked me then whether I had identity issues, I would have laughed. I would have said I was fine. I would have meant I was functioning. Functioning is not the same as being known. The shift didn't happen with a dramatic revelation. It happened with an ordinary evening that got under my skin because it was so gentle. We'd been together a while, long enough to know each other's habits. We were folding laundry, one of those unglamorous tasks that somehow becomes intimate when you live with someone. I was in my usual mode, efficient, quiet, getting it done. My partner was humming. At some point they held up a piece of clothing, something soft, light, the kind of fabric that feels like it's made to forgive you for being tired, and they said, casually, "This would look good on you." I laughed automatically, not because it was funny, but because that's what my body did when something threatened the edges of the room I'd built. I made a joke. I think I said something like, "Yeah, sure, and I'll start a fashion blog." My partner didn't laugh in a mocking way. They just looked at me, calm, not teasing, and said, "I'm not joking. I think it might feel good. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. I wonder if you'd like it." That was the first time I felt the strange combination of being seen and being terrified by it. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. The terror wasn't about the clothing itself. It was about what the suggestion implied, that there might be a door in me I'd never opened, and that someone else had noticed the outline of it. I said no. Not angrily. Just quickly. My brain served up reasons like a vending machine. It's not me. People would judge. It's weird. It's unnecessary. Why complicate things? I said, that's not my thing, and tried to move on. But the moment didn't move on inside me. It stayed, echoing. Not because I suddenly wanted to change my whole life overnight, but because the suggestion had rearranged my sense of what was possible. My partner hadn't said it like a dare. They hadn't said it like a trap. They'd said it like offering me a glass of water when I didn't realize I was thirsty. For a few days, I acted normal and felt anything but. I caught myself thinking about that fabric, the softness, the idea of being allowed to feel good in a different way. Then I'd feel shame for thinking about it. Shame is like a reflex. It fires before you even decide what you believe. It's an old alarm system installed by other people. I didn't tell my partner what was happening in my head. I didn't want to make it real. Instead, I became slightly more tense, slightly more distracted. My partner noticed, of course. They didn't push. They asked if I was okay. I said yes. Functioning. The next time it came up, it was even more ordinary. We were watching a show, something with a character who played with gender presentation in a way that wasn't treated as a punchline. My partner said, I like that. The confidence. The honesty. Then they glanced at me and added, softly, I think you'd look beautiful if you ever wanted to try. That word, beautiful, hit me harder than I expected. Men like me grow up trained to chase certain compliments and reject others. Handsome, strong, capable. Beautiful is coded as forbidden territory, like stepping into a room you've been told isn't for you. Hearing it offered sincerely, without ridicule, created a kind of grief I hadn't anticipated. Grief for all the ways I'd limited myself before I even knew I was doing it. That night I finally admitted something small. Not the whole truth, because I didn't know it yet. But I said, I don't know. It makes me nervous. My partner nodded like I'd just told them the weather. That makes sense, they said. We can go slow. Or not at all. I just want you to have choices. Choices. That's what this was really about. Not clothes. Not labels. Choices. The first step happened on a weekend when we had the apartment to ourselves and no plans. My partner asked again, gently, if I wanted to try something small. They didn't bring out anything dramatic. No costumes. No performance. Just a simple piece of clothing that could pass as unisex if you didn't think too hard about it. They held it out like it was no big deal. My hands shook a little when I took it. That surprised me. I'd done plenty of harder things in life. I'd taken exams, interviewed for jobs, handled crises. Why was a piece of fabric making my heart race? Because it wasn't fabric. It was permission. It was risk. It was the possibility of discovering something about myself that I might not be able to put back in the box. I went into the bedroom to change, closing the door like I was hiding from an invisible jury. I remember standing there looking at my reflection, half undressed, feeling ridiculous and guilty and curious all at once. I put the clothing on and waited for the wave of embarrassment. It came, but it wasn't the only thing that came. There was also a quiet sense of relief that I didn't expect. My shoulders dropped. My breathing slowed. It felt, not magical, not like a movie transformation, but like taking off shoes that were too tight and realizing you'd been tolerating discomfort for years without noticing. I stared at myself and tried to label what I was feeling. I couldn't. I just knew it was real. When I walked back out, my partner didn't clap or squeal. They didn't treat it like entertainment. They smiled, warmly, and said, "How do you feel?" That question, "How do you feel?" became the central question of my life after that. Not what do you look like, not what will people think, not what does this mean in a headline. How do you feel? I said, weird. But, kind of okay. My partner said, okay, is a good start. We made tea. We talked about nothing. We let it be normal. That normality was the most radical part. It told my nervous system that this wasn't a crisis. It was just a new truth being allowed to exist. After that, the changes were small. So small that if you tried to chart them on a timeline, you might not see them. But inside me, each small step was a negotiation with fear. I tried a different shirt. Then a softer fabric. Then something that was unmistakably designed for a feminine shape, and I felt the old shame flare up again, hot and fast. My partner didn't argue with my shame. They didn't tell me to just be confident. They asked questions. They listened. They helped me separate the fear of judgment from the actual experience in my body. That was the first educational lesson I learned in a deeply personal way. Feelings are data, not verdicts. Shame feels like a verdict, like the universe stamping wrong on your forehead, but it's usually just data about what you were trained to fear. I started paying attention to when I felt most at peace. It wasn't always when I was dressed differently. Sometimes it was when I allowed myself to be emotionally open, when I spoke in a softer tone, when I let myself admit uncertainty instead of forcing an answer. Sometimes the clothing was just a doorway into a bigger permission, to stop performing the version of masculinity I'd inherited. There were also hard moments. I'd catch my reflection unexpectedly and panic, thinking, what am I doing? Who am I becoming? I worried I was betraying my past self. I worried I was making my partner into a therapist instead of a partner. I worried I was indulging something irresponsible. So we set rules. That might sound unromantic, but it was healthy. We agreed that this exploration wouldn't be used to avoid responsibilities. We agreed we'd check in about emotional load. We agreed that honesty mattered more than momentum. If I felt overwhelmed, we paused. If my partner felt uncertain, we talked. That was the second major lesson. Identity exploration is not an excuse to abandon responsibility. It's a reason to practice it more carefully. At some point my partner said something that framed it in a way that made me exhale. They said, you don't have to decide what this means yet. You can just notice what's true. Notice what's true. Not decide what you are. Not pick a label. Not announce a new identity to the world. Just notice. I began noticing patterns. I noticed that when I dressed in a more feminine way at home, I moved differently, not exaggerated, not theatrical, just less armored. I noticed I was kinder to myself. I noticed my anxiety decreased on days when I let myself be that version of me privately. I also noticed that the fear didn't go away. It changed shape. It became less about the mirror and more about the world. Because the world is where consequences live. The first time we had to interact with someone while I still had traces of that private self on me, maybe a subtle nail care, maybe a slightly different cut of clothing, maybe a softer hairstyle, I felt like a spotlight had been turned on. Nobody said anything. That was the point. Nobody had to say anything for my brain to imagine everything. Later, when we met friends for dinner, I spent half the night monitoring myself. Was I sitting wrong? Was I gesturing wrong? Was my voice wrong? I realized how much energy I'd always spent policing myself, even before any of this started. The exploration didn't create the fear, it revealed it. There was a night after one of those social outings when I told my partner, I can't do this. I can't handle the attention. My partner said, but you didn't get attention. I said, that's not what it feels like. They nodded. I know. Your brain is trying to protect you. We can go at your pace. That pace was slow. Slower than the version of this story some people expect. There were no sudden leaps. There were weeks where nothing changed. There were weeks where I went backward, putting everything away and telling myself it was over, only to feel a dull sadness that told me I was lying. Then, gradually, the focus shifted from clothes to identity in a deeper sense. I started asking myself questions I'd never asked with seriousness. What parts of me were authentic, and what parts were survival strategies? When did I learn that softness was dangerous? What did being a man mean to me, apart from what I'd been told? If I removed other people's expectations, what would I choose? Those questions didn't have clean answers. They produced grief, because to explore identity honestly is to confront the ways you've abandoned yourself in order to be acceptable. I mourned the younger me who had felt that tug of envy and buried it. I mourned the years I'd spent thinking I was fine when I was actually just compliant. Around that time, my partner suggested something that scared me more than clothing ever had. They said, "What if we talked about this with someone? A therapist. Not because you're broken, but because you deserve support." My first reaction was defensive. Therapy felt like admitting a problem. But the truth was I was carrying more than I could hold alone. So I agreed. Therapy didn't give me a label. It gave me tools. It helped me name the difference between identity and presentation. It helped me understand that exploring femininity doesn't automatically mean you're trying to become someone else. It can mean you're integrating what you were taught to suppress. It helped me examine my anxiety and the way my brain catastrophized social consequences. It helped me practice self-respect in a form I hadn't known, setting boundaries, communicating needs, tolerating discomfort without panic. One of the most important things my therapist said, something I wrote down afterward, was that authenticity is not the same as impulsiveness. Being true to yourself doesn't mean doing everything you feel immediately. It means aligning your actions with your values, not your fear. Sometimes that means taking a step forward. Sometimes it means pausing to build stability first. Stability mattered because my life didn't exist in a vacuum. I had family. I had coworkers. I had a community that had known me in one way for years. Every step toward being more openly feminine, even in small ways, carried the possibility of misunderstanding, gossip, rejection. This is where the story gets heavier, not because anything dramatic happened, but because I had to face real ethical choices. There's a romantic myth that self-discovery is always liberating and applauded by everyone you love. Real life is messier. People have their own fears, their own beliefs, their own limits. And you can't control their reactions, only your honesty and your care. I started with my partner's support and one trusted friend. I chose that friend because they were kind and because they had shown, in other situations, an ability to listen without making everything about themselves. I told them, quietly, over coffee, that I'd been exploring a more feminine side of myself at home, that it was helping me feel more whole, and that I was scared. My friend blinked, then said, "Thank you for telling me." And then they asked, "What do you need from me?" I almost cried right there, not because it was dramatic, but because it was such a simple model of empathy. Ask what the person needs. Not interrogate. Not advise. Not make jokes to relieve your own discomfort. Just ask. Not everyone reacted that way. When I eventually told a family member, someone I loved, someone whose opinion still had the power to make me feel like a child again, they went quiet in a way that felt like a door closing. They didn't yell. They didn't disown me. They just looked confused and said, "Why would you do that? Isn't that? I don't know. Isn't that something else?" I tried to explain, but I realized I was trying to win a court case, not share my truth. I kept saying what it wasn't. It's not this. It's not that. It's not a joke. It's not about attention. The more I talked, the more they looked overwhelmed. Later I felt guilty. I'd wanted them to understand quickly, to reassure me, to make it easy. But understanding is a process, not a switch. I reminded myself of something I'd learned in therapy. I'm responsible for being honest and respectful. I'm not responsible for managing someone else's emotions. Still, I cared. So I tried again later, more gently. I acknowledged their confusion. I told them I wasn't asking them to use perfect words. I was asking them to keep seeing me as me. I told them that this exploration had helped my mental health, that it had made me more patient, more emotionally present, not less. That conversation didn't end with a warm, cinematic hug. It ended with cautious acceptance and a lot of silence afterward. But the silence wasn't punishment. It was processing. And I learned something else. Sometimes love looks like someone staying in the room with you even when they don't fully understand. At work, I stayed private for a long time. Not because I was ashamed, but because my workplace wasn't the place where I felt safest experimenting. This was another ethical choice, protecting myself. There's no moral trophy for coming out everywhere. Safety matters. Stability matters. You have to choose your arenas. But private life has its own pressures. Over time, my partner and I started renegotiating how we related to each other. Not in a sexualized way, but in the daily ways that define a relationship: who does what, how we speak, how we show care. I noticed I wanted to be more openly nurturing. I wanted to cook more, to host, to create a home that felt soft rather than merely functional. I'd always been capable of those things, but I treated them like chores. Now they felt like expression. My partner noticed too. One evening they said, "You seem happier. Lighter." I said, "I feel like I'm finally letting myself exist." They asked, "Do you want to change how you're seen in our relationship?" That question held both tenderness and weight. Because to change how you're seen is to change the story you've been telling together. I was afraid of asking for too much. I was afraid of disappointing them. I was afraid that my exploration would eventually reveal an incompatibility we couldn't bridge. So we talked. Slowly. We talked about what felt good and what felt scary. We talked about language. We talked about roles, but we were careful with that word, because roles can become cages if you're not paying attention. The point wasn't to swap one rigid script for another. The point was to build something that fit us. There were moments when I realized I had internalized a strange kind of prejudice. I thought femininity meant weakness, or dependence, or frivolity. Even though I didn't consciously believe that about women, part of me had absorbed it. So when I felt myself leaning into femininity, another part of me panicked. Are you becoming less capable? Are you giving up your strength? The truth was the opposite. I was becoming stronger, but not in the way I'd been trained to admire. I was strengthening my emotional endurance. I was learning to sit with discomfort without turning it into anger. I was learning to ask for what I needed without apologizing for existing. That kind of strength isn't loud. It doesn't win arguments. It makes relationships livable. As months became years, my presentation at home became more consistently feminine. Not always. Not as a rule. As a preference. I learned what fabrics soothed my senses. I learned what colors made me feel calm. I learned that my body wasn't an enemy to be disciplined but a home to be cared for. I learned that grooming could be a form of respect rather than vanity. And with each step, I faced the same question in a new form: is this about hiding, or about choosing? When I dressed more traditionally masculine for certain family gatherings, was I betraying myself, or was I making a strategic decision about safety and emotional bandwidth? I learned not to judge myself harshly. Identity isn't proven by suffering. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose the option that keeps you stable enough to keep growing. There was, however, one turning point that did feel like a line crossed. It wasn't public. It was between my partner and me. It happened when we were discussing the future, long-term plans, what kind of life we wanted, what kind of home we wanted to build. My partner said, "When I imagine us older, I don't imagine you shrinking back into a role that hurts you. I imagine you comfortable. I imagine you seen." I sat with that. Comfortable. Seen. Those were the two things I'd always craved without admitting it. I told them, carefully, "Sometimes I think I want to be your wife." The word landed in the room like a fragile object. I didn't mean it as a joke, and I didn't mean it as a demand. I meant it as a description of an inner orientation I hadn't fully allowed myself to name. Not necessarily about legal status, not necessarily about stereotypes, but about a relational identity. I wanted to be held and recognized in a feminine way within the partnership. I wanted that softness to be honored rather than treated as a temporary experiment. My partner didn't react with shock. They looked thoughtful. Then they asked, "What does a wife mean to you?" That question saved us from turning the word into a cliché. I thought about it and realized I didn't want the burdens women have historically been forced to carry. I didn't want submission as a virtue. I didn't want my partner to become an authority. I wanted mutuality. I wanted devotion without erasure. I wanted to be able to give and receive care without the old gender rules policing the exchange. So I said, it means I want to be your partner in a way that feels honest to me. I want to feel beautiful in our life. I want to build a home with you and not feel like I'm acting. I want to be loved without having to be hard. My partner's eyes filled, and they said, then let's build that. But we'll do it in a way that keeps you safe and keeps us healthy. That was the beginning of integration. Not the end of fear didn't disappear, but the beginning of living as a whole person rather than two halves negotiating a truce. Integration looked like practical choices. It looked like figuring out what name I wanted to hear in private. It looked like deciding whether I wanted to change my grooming habits permanently. It looked like learning how to respond when someone made a casual joke about masculinity or femininity. It looked like preparing for holidays where family members might ask pointed questions. It looked like choosing supportive communities, online and offline, that didn't treat identity exploration like a performance but like a human process. It also looked like accountability. I didn't want my journey to become my partner's burden. So we kept checking in. I stayed in therapy. I educated myself about gender norms and the way they harm everyone, not just people who break them. I learned to apologize when my anxiety made me self-centered. I learned to say thank you in a way that wasn't indebtedness but recognition. Over time, the people closest to us adapted. Some never fully understood, but they learned that understanding wasn't the price of love. Respect was. A few relationships grew distant. That hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. There were nights I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering if I'd ruined something permanently. But there were also surprises. There were people who, once they saw I wasn't asking for drama, relaxed. There were relatives who started asking questions with genuine curiosity. There were friends who told me, quietly, that my honesty gave them permission to be honest about their own struggles, even if their struggles were different. I learned that authenticity can be contagious, not because it's trendy, but because it reminds people that they don't have to suffer silently to be respectable. The most profound changes were internal. I stopped measuring my worth by how well I performed toughness. I started measuring it by how well I lived my values: kindness, responsibility, courage, humility. I became more patient. I became a better listener. I also became more aware of how much casual cruelty society directs at anyone who steps outside expectations. That awareness didn't make me bitter. It made me deliberate. It made me choose my words carefully, choose my battles wisely, and protect my mental health without hardening my heart. If you're listening to this and wondering what the point of my story is, I want to say something clearly: there is no single correct outcome for identity exploration. Not everyone who experiments with presentation will want to change their life. Not everyone will use the same words. Some people will try something and realize it's not for them, and that is just as valid and just as healthy. The goal is not to force a transformation. The goal is to live with honesty and self-respect, to reduce shame, to increase empathy, and to build relationships that can hold truth without collapsing. I also want to say something about fear, because fear is what keeps most people stuck. Fear tells you that if you change, you'll lose everything. Sometimes fear is right about risk. The world can be harsh. But fear is often wrong about certainty. It speaks in absolutes: always, never, everyone, no one. Real life is more nuanced. Some people will surprise you. Some will disappoint you. Most will be too busy with their own lives to scrutinize you as much as you imagine. And the ones who do scrutinize you, those are the people whose approval was always conditional anyway. What I became, in the end, wasn't a character. I didn't become a spectacle. I became a person who stopped running from softness. In my private life, in my home, in my marriage, I became the kind of spouse I used to think I wasn't allowed to be. If a wife is the word that fits for me, it's because it represents a kind of relational truth. I am nurturing, I am emotionally present, I am devoted, I am comfortable being seen as feminine by the person I love. And I am still myself. The same mind, the same history, the same values, just less armored. There are still days when I catch an old reflex rising, an urge to hide, an urge to make a joke, an urge to minimize myself so no one can accuse me of being too much. When that happens, I try to treat the reflex with compassion rather than contempt. That reflex kept me safe when I didn't have better tools. Now I have better tools. I can thank it and choose differently. I also keep perspective. My journey doesn't make me morally superior. It doesn't make me special. It makes me responsible for how I show up in the world. It makes me responsible for not projecting my pain onto others. It makes me responsible for being truthful with the people I love. And it makes me responsible for remembering that everyone you meet is carrying something you can't see. If there's one thing I wish I could tell my younger self, the kid who learned to be simple to be safe, it would be this: you don't have to earn the right to be whole. You can grow at your own pace. You can be careful and brave at the same time. And you deserve relationships where honesty is met with curiosity instead of punishment. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.